We have a good friend of ours calling in right now, Aaron Renn, R-E-N-N. He's the original good fella, and that was the Mavericks. Aaron's all around. He's in flyover country, stationed out of New York, writes for Urban File, Forbes magazine. Very special guest, good friend. Aaron, welcome back to the John Fredericks Show. You were with Colonel Mike.
Thanks for having me back on, and as always, fantastic music selection.
Oh, thank you, sir. You got DJ Colonel Mike and DJ Mike at the keyboards.
Yeah, well, not only do I live in New York, I used to live in Chicago, so I was enjoying the verse about Chicago.
Well, I was bringing you all around because you write about flyover, Midwest, and everything going on. Aaron, I was watching some of your columns, reading them. The one before the last, you had something about the infrastructure. Let's talk about that today. Let's give the listeners what you wrote about infrastructure and Trump.
Yeah, well, I'd written up a piece about his infrastructure plan when he released it. You know, Trump has put this $1.5 trillion infrastructure proposal out there. It hasn't passed Congress, and I think it's highly questionable that it will. But I see this as taking a page out of his real estate developer handbook. Rather than the federal government spending $1.5 trillion on infrastructure, what he wants to do is put in a little bit of his own money, that is to say the federal money, and then try to leverage that with a lot of money from states, local governments, and private officials. So he's trying to essentially provide an incentive for other people to come up with money. And so he's trying to do this carrot approach as opposed to some of the traditional ways that the federal government has financed, say, highways, where the feds would give 80% and the states would give a small match. He's looking to essentially reverse that, saying, why don't I put in the 20, up to 20, maybe even less, and you come up with the rest of the money.
Is that a good plan, Aaron?
I like that approach, actually, in a number of ways. When the federal government is paying for 80% of something, you don't have a lot of incentives to make really good decisions. So there are a lot of roads to nowhere that have been built in America because basically when the federal government's paying for it, you don't have a lot of incentive to spend your money that wisely. But when you have to come up with most of the money from your own taxpayers, and you got to make the case in the state legislature, or you have to impose a toll, or you have to raise private funds, then you're much more likely to spend money on things that are more appropriate. I think it could impose some fiscal discipline. Also, the federal government is deeply in debt, simply can't afford to spend much money, to be honest, although they keep doing it. And something that moves towards a more devolved system where states and localities take the lead makes sense to me because there are just such diverse needs in different places. I mean, even within states like Virginia, much less between states. In New York, you know, we really need a lot of money to be spent on our subway system. That's not the case in Indiana, where I grew up. Mm-hmm. They need to be able to repair bridges and things like that. So having systems that are more state-driven and more flexible that way, a more devolved system, I think is a better approach.
Well, Aaron, are you familiar with the metro system in Washington, D.C. that runs through Maryland and Virginia?
Yes, I am.
And, you know, that's just a cost overrun. It's a constant cost overrun. It's a boondoggle. They have a board and another board and a board on top of a board. It's like plywood and 2x4s. And for some reason or another, like today, let's say it's a Martin Luther King Day, but, you know, it's a special national holiday. The trains break. Major tourism weekend, let's say Cherry Blossom, the trains break. The escalators don't work. It's almost like time not to work at peak time when you have a tourist season. And then they come up with 100 excuses, and then they say to Virginia or Maryland, hey, you know, you guys got to kick in another $2-3 million a year to help us with this maintenance. I agree with you that states should kick in, and I agree on the infrastructure. But when it comes to the metro system in Washington, and this is, you know, one of the nicest, cleanest capital cities in the world, you know that, we have the worst infrastructure when it comes to metro.
Well, Metro is actually a good example of some bad decision-making in America. in that a lot of what we've done with infrastructure is we have focused on building a lot of new infrastructure, while at the same time we are not maintaining the existing infrastructure. So in the case of Metro, the system has really not been well maintained.
I agree.
At all. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, they were building this new Silver Line out towards Dulles Airport, and you've got Maryland that wants to build this Purple Line, which is technically not part of the Metro system, but still it's a new rail line out in Maryland. And it's like, why are you talking about building all these new lines and raising all this new money when the basic maintenance on the system that you already have is not being performed and it's not reliable, and ridership is declining because of reliability issues, just as what's happening in New York. So prioritizing maintenance over new construction is really something that we need to be doing in America. And a lot of that's not, per se the federal government's fault. The incentives for politicians are always to cut ribbons on new things and not to maintain what we already have. And so one of the switches that we need to make as a country is to kind of create a new psychology or a way to gain glory from maintenance, because what we really need for the most part is to make America's infrastructure great again, not to go build a whole bunch of new infrastructure in most cases. Though, of course, in rapidly growing places like Dallas or Houston, we need to do it. A lot of America is not growing, or it's even shrinking, and there are really old sewer systems, water systems, roads, transit systems that are not being maintained. If we're not maintaining them, we shouldn't be building new things, because then you're just adding to the pile of things you can't pay to keep up.
Well, I believe that's happening in New York State with Governor Cuomo. I mean, this stuff is so old. Although, Aaron, I will give it this. It's the best tap water, I think, in the country. Don't you agree?
Oh, New York. Actually, we have phenomenal water in New York.
Yeah.
And New York City has actually been one of the places that has invested heavily in its water system. Mm-hmm. Everything in New York is about 5 or 10 times as cost as it should be. But I think New York City is spending something like $10 billion on water infrastructure. I'm not making that up. So there has been a lot of investment there. And you're right, people years ago built these pristine reservoirs up in the mountains, and it is great tap water, largely untreated because it's kept so pure.
Yeah,
but if you don't maintain your pipes, you won't be able to get it there. And so
but
that's
also,
why there's been a lot of pipe maintenance and things like that in New York.
Also, the subway system is so old, Aaron. It ran for so many years, and it ran on time, But, again, like you say, it's all about maintenance. But I would not compare Metro D.C. to New York. New York runs 24/7. And the reason people don't ride the Metro all the time in Washington, D.C. is, you can't get a train late at night. They pretty much run, one train after 10. You can't get into Virginia after a certain hour. You can't get into Maryland after a certain hour. So you basically have to park your car in D.C. or around close to D.C., catch the last train, let's say 7, 8 o'clock, then get in your car. So although it's a metro, it's not a full-time metro like other big cities, where the metro is running all the time, like New York 24/7.
Yeah, well, it's rare. New York is a very rare case. Very few cities around the world have 24-hour service. Even Paris shuts down at night. But the key is, you're right, in the evenings, Metro doesn't run very long. So, I was in D.C. once. I'm like, I'll just take the Metro back to my hotel after dinner. I get there. It's going to be 16 minutes to the next train. I'm like, what? I can walk there faster than that. And so when you don't run very often in the evenings, it's not a very convenient way to get around. And not many people ride it, not surprisingly.
And I don't know if you were listening earlier in the show or not, but yesterday, a ride that should have taken 2 hours or 2.5 hours. Mike, how long does it take to get from Springfield? About 2.5 hours down here? I'd say 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours. It took me 6 hours yesterday because you have so much congestion, so much traffic on the interstate. They build here. They build more housing. They just create more jobs because this is right outside the Beltway, a couple hours. Mm-hmm. But you get 2 accidents here, and it's a 6-hour ride, which should have been a 2-hour ride. And it's just frustrating because these guys run in the Commonwealth of Virginia. They constantly run on transportation, and we're going to fix this and that. And then the state police don't pull the cars over. The accident backs it up for miles. Commerce is at a standstill. People can't get home. Tourists are frustrated, This is the only route to go back and forth to Florida unless you get on Interstate 81 going up towards Boston, Pennsylvania. So this is really a main thoroughfare, and it's like Bangkok or L.A., I want to say, Aaron, most of the day. A good portion of the day.
Well, Washington is famous for its bad traffic, sort of like L.A. and other cities. And I think there's a lot of debates between people on what you do. There's sort of rival visions of urban transportation in a lot of places. You have a lot of people who are like, well, basically, we need to have everyone living in town,
right,
in high-density apartments, and, we need to rely on transit and bicycling and things like that. Then you sort of have the highway people who are like, we need to build more housing on the edge, we need to build more roads. And a lot of times you end up with essentially, as it were, gridlock, and people don't end up doing a lot because there's various opponents of doing anything there. Washington has been a rapidly growing region, yes. So it's one of the places in America. It might be one of the few places I'm a little bit sad that is growing. I normally like economic growth and population growth, but a lot of the growth in D.C. has come because the federal government just keeps growing.
Well, you brought up
I don't know if that's a good thing, but the region has been, prosperous and growing, and so you do need to build more infrastructure in the cases where you have a rapidly growing population. And so if you haven't kept up with that, then
their roads are very good.
Well, but the key is if you're not maintaining the roads and the systems you have, building new ones doesn't make a lot of sense. So you have to find a way to maintain first.
Aaron, New York and New Jersey would envy this place. Every 2 years they put blacktop. I mean, don't forget who lives here.
Yeah.
The elected officials live in this area, so they make sure their roads are really pristine. But you brought up the Silver Line before. Let me just give you a little idea about the Silver Line. It was $4 billion to build, I think, which the cost was a little better than half that the federal government flipped for, because the people on the Appropriation Committee at the time and the Finance Committee at the time were senior members of the Virginia delegation in Congress. So the money was swiftly moved. The Silver Line, the $4 billion boondoggle Silver Line, was supposed to get to the airport. Imagine, like, you have the nation's capital, you can't get to the airport, the main airport, Dulles, right? And it was supposed to go out there, but it got to a place called Reston, which is like a fixed city. It's a grow city.
It's an ed city, yeah. I'm very familiar with Reston.
Okay, Reston. And basically what it did is it helped the developers when you got the train there. Now they started the urban building, the new apartments, the new style urban apartments, the walkable city and all the shopping and the commercial and jobs. It was very good. I don't think it's out to Dulles yet. I think it's going to be another year or so. But that was pushed through because developers knew that if they would get that Silver Line, let's just say, for instance, where the Silver Line is, I think it's Leesburg Pike in Northern Virginia. It was an automobile row, Aaron, for many years, 30 years, automobile row. Well, your property at the time was $25, $50 million, car lot. You would have to probably sell cars for the next 150 years for what they got for their property. When these guys sold and moved their car dealerships outside that area, what happened is the county also increased the air rights. You were only allowed to go up 10 stories, but now you can go up, let's say, 30 stories, right? So the county increases that. Overnight, the auto dealers on that auto row, which is all it was strip malls and auto road, circa 70, the properties went from $25 million to $168 million overnight by having that metro go down that road towards, the Silver Line going towards the airport. So the developers came in. I mean, now if you come into that area in Northern Virginia, the next time you're here, if you take the Silver Line, you could see that area I'm talking about, the automobile row. It's just developed unbelievable, Aaron. I mean, the rents went from $900, $1,100, $1,200 up to $3,200. This is Northern Virginia outside of D.C. It's not Manhattan.
Nice work if you can get it.
Yeah, right. So what else is happening in New York, Aaron? What are we missing with de Blasio?
Well, we've got the exciting news right now is we've got Cynthia Nixon, the actress from Sex and the City, who's now running for governor against Andrew Cuomo. So we're seeing more celebrities get into the political act. We'll see if Donald Trump making it into the Oval Office really kicks off an avalanche of more of this. You know, there's talk about Oprah running for president, and this and that, and you know, a lot of the criticisms of New York go to De Blasio, who has been a weak mayor in a lot of ways, but I don't think enough attention gets paid to Andrew Cuomo.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, the governor of New York has vastly more power than the mayor. In fact, the governor can essentially override the mayor whenever he wants, and he's sort of a dictator who just does whatever he wants. He inserts provisions into the budget at the last minute. The subway system of New York, which has been breaking down, making a lot of news nationally, the governor runs that. The mayor doesn't even run it. And so, if I were going to give any suggestions to the people outside world, it's pay more attention to the sorts of things that Andrew Cuomo has done as opposed to De Blasio. Now, Cuomo is certainly a more effective leader. He can get some things done. You know, he's built some infrastructure, but you know, and sadly, it doesn't just matter, you know, that you can get things done. It also matters what it is that you actually do, and that's where there's been a lot of challenges. And of course, many corruption investigations. You know, a lot of his economic development team is under indictment on trial.
But that's standard for New York politics, Aaron. That's standard.
Right, you know, so it's you know, corruption is kind of an issue. I mean, that's one of the things that you know we got used to with in city government with you know, Giuliani, you know, who's a former federal prosecutor, very clean, and then you had Bloomberg, who had so much money that you can't. You know, he's not going to take any bribes or anything. He just doesn't need it. And now you've got, you know, De Blasio, who's more of a, you know, traditional politician, you know, so it's, you know, campaign donors getting favors and these sorts of things and investigations swirling around and controversies, and, you know, with Cuomo as well. And, you know, you're right. It's kind of par for the course, unfortunately.
Well, you know, down here in the Beltway area, they call that the Cuomo crime family because the brother's on CNN and the other brother's the governor. And you know what the funny thing is? They talk about Donald Trump, how rich he was. Believe it or not, Donald Trump grew up in the same neighborhood Cuomo grew up in, very close by, and Geraldine Ferraro, another iconic Democrat who passed away. She was out of that area. And, you know, they all grew up in the same neighborhood in that part of Queens. By the way, I also heard that the new hotspot now, Williamsburg is no longer the hotspot. If it's too heavy on the price, Sunset Park is really hitting it off in Brooklyn, the Chinatown area.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that. I do know that they're getting ready to close the subway that goes to Williamsburg for about a couple of years to do maintenance on it. So people are sort of casting a wary eye there. You know, one of the interesting things that happened, the Census Bureau just released their new population estimates. Brooklyn's population actually fell by 2,000 people last year.
Well, let me ask you a question. What is the population now? When I lived in Manhattan, Brooklyn was the largest borough in New York. I think it was 4.8 million people.
Yeah, it's still the largest borough. It's not the 4 million. It's more like 2.4 or something like that. I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but it is the largest borough.
Wow. But, you know, another problem that New York has, Aaron, which is always in the paper, is the New York City Housing Authority, the NYCHA. There's like 900 million or 1.2 billion they need just to, you know, keep up with the boilers and the lead paint and so on. And one lady just won a settlement for 10 million. And I think that's under de Blasio's control. You know, the housing authority is big. It's very big.
What happened in a lot of cities, you know, we built all this public housing, a lot of it in high-rise buildings. Much of that, like all the projects in Chicago, Cabrini Green and those, were all torn down.
Wow.
So they've essentially, many cities tore down their housing projects because they were, you know, notorious for crime and drugs and many other things. And the idea is we don't want to just have concentrations of extreme poverty in these high-rise buildings. Let's, you know, have more scattered site housing where people with lower incomes are integrated into neighborhoods. Well, that kind of, you know, has some unintended consequences, perhaps, in some of these cities. New York did not do that. New York has retained its public housing. There's a large amount, huge footprint of public housing in New York, but it is, like a lot of things, is old, and it needs many billions in repairs, and the money has just not been there.
Aaron, we're down to the last 30 seconds.
The challenge on that is these people in government claim we need to spend more money, or it's mean, but they've been giving away unbelievable amounts on pensions and labor agreements.
Of course.
And if we just hadn't had these escalating pension and health care payments, there would be plenty of money.
Aaron, I hate to cut you off. We're down to the last 30 seconds. We got to get out for news.
Yep.
Thank you once again for coming back on, Aaron Renn.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great, and all the best to you guys.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. Bye now.